What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. I'll be going over 5 wide receivers today that you probably should not have drafted. And if you haven't drafted yet, then don't draft these 5. But regardless of which camp you fall into, if you have or haven't drafted yet, the Week 1 rankings are up on the site now. So you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But for today's video, let's start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which wide receiver led the league in air yards per game in 2019. The answer was Mike Evans, and John Jacobs was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, among running backs with at least 400 snaps last season, who ran the fewest routes per game? And a hint on that one, I posted the answer on Twitter last week. So if you follow me, you got a pretty good chance of getting this one right. That's enough about the stat of the day. Let's talk about some wide receivers. And first up, we have C.Sutton. This is probably my strongest stance of the offseason, at least at the wide receiver position. And I just don't get what people see in Sutton from a fantasy perspective. I am fully on board. He is an awesome wide receiver. And honestly, I think he's going to have a really good year. But for fantasy, he's going too early. I like the Broncos as a team, but people are hyping them up way too much. Drew Lock might be good, but we have no idea if he is at this point. Sutton was a wide receiver 26 in points per game last season, and the only changes are that they've added in Melvin Gordon and Jerry Jeudy, 2 players who are likely going to command close to 130, 140, maybe even targets combined, obviously not each. And not to mention that Noah Fant is entering his 2nd season, and he's absolutely going to see more targets than he had last year. So even if Sutton is a great wide receiver, Locke would have to just go off for him to pay off his ADP. Because remember, he was 26th in points per game last season. So he'll need to improve on those numbers in order to even return value. Never mind exceed value, which is what we would prefer to happen when we draft players. And I don't think that's possible. Like, unless you think Jerry Jeudy's bad, but I can assure you he's not. He's an incredible receiver, and he's going to command a larger target share than Deshaun Hamilton and Tim Patrick. Okay, so I get loving the talent on C.Sutton, and I really do think he's going to have a good year. I just don't see him returning value at his ADP, and I don't see a scenario, unless there are mass injuries on this team, where he outperforms his ADP. And again, you want players who at least have a chance at outperforming their ADP. Second wide receiver we'll go over today is A.J. Green. I've gone back and forth on this one for a while because on the one hand, I really do think the Bengals offense is going to be vastly improved this season now that they have Joe Burrow at quarterback. And if A.J. Green can stay healthy, then he might be a big reason why they can improve so much. You know, the combination of Joe Burrow and returning these incredible weapons. So I get it, honestly, if you want to draft him. The problem I have is that we haven't seen a healthy A.J. Green in a long time. You know, the last game he played was week 13 of 2018. And since 2016, he's struggled to stay healthy. He's missed 6 games in 2016 with a hamstring injury, 7 games in 2018 with a toe sprain, and then all of last season after ankle reconstruction surgery. Then camp starts late this season, so he doesn't get a ton of time with Burrow. And then he's already missed time battling a hamstring injury. Now, it seems like he's recovered from the hamstring, and he will be good to go in week 1. But he hasn't joined the team for 11 on 11s, at least as of recording this. It kind of seems like they're just going to bubble wrap him. They're just saying, hey, recover from the hamstring. We know you're good. We know you're going to be involved. We're going to throw you out there in week 1. But I want A.J. Green to be out there practicing, to be working up to a full workload, because he's the type of player, if you bubble wrap him, if you don't give him these practice reps to acclimate his body, he's going to have another injury. He's going to hurt his groin, or he's going to have a hamstring injury, some sort of soft tissue injury. Like, honestly, if they're not throwing him out there in these practices and he just goes full go in week 1, I'm very concerned that he's going to suffer another injury or re-aggravate the hamstring. So when you consider that, you consider that this isn't just a normal player. This is A.J. Green, who suffered a ton of these injuries when he's had time to prepare for the season. Now he has less time. And also, he's not a lock to just dominate the target share, right? I think when people think of A.J. Green, they think of all these seasons where he's just been super focused on the offense. But they have Mixon getting a good amount of workload. You know, Auden Tate, you might laugh, but he's been crushing in camp, so he's going to have some sort of role. He's not going to dominate, but he's going to have some sort of role. We know that Tyler Boyd is locked into the slot snaps, and he's going to have a good amount of targets. He could realistically be the most targeted receiver on this team. They do have John Ross to scheme some deep looks to. They do have their second-round rookie, T. Higgins, who is a pretty darn good prospect. So it's not like Green is the only person they have to throw to. So I just don't want you guys to fall into the trap of drafting based off of name value. I don't think people watching this video will. I'm sure a lot of people will, though. I've seen plenty of stories where people are drafting A.J. Green over A.J. Brown. What? Like, you can't just look and say, ooh, we've gotten A.J. Green on a discount. This is not the A.J. Green we're used to seeing. And there's a lot of risk in taking him even at his ADP. Just the upside is far lower than it used to be, even with Joe Burrow at quarterback, who, again, I think is going to have a great season. I just don't think that means A.J. Green necessarily pays off his ADP. So there's just other players I would really prefer to go to in his range. Next up, we have J.Brown, and he had, honestly, just an incredible season last year. He had an above average success rate on every single route. He ranked in the 85th percentile or better against man and press coverage. He proved when he's healthy, he's a number 1 starting caliber NFL wide receiver. A number 1. You can put him on a ton of teams. He's the best receiver. The problem is that was the perfect season. He dominated while staying healthy, and he was still just the wide receiver 22 in points per game. So that's the ceiling, 22. But that's really good. You look at that and you say, I'll take it. You know, given his current ADP, that would crush it. The problem is that they have the fewest vacated targets in the entire league at just 35. Only 35 targets left over from last season. They're only missing 5.6% of their air yards from last year. So bringing in Diggs is just going to crush everyone's fantasy value, at least for the receivers. Diggs is a better wide receiver than J.Brown, and the Bills know that. That's why they gave up a ton of draft capital to go out and get him. And adding him to the wide receiver core is amazing for the Bills as a team, but it's going to really hurt Brown's opportunity. The Bills ranked 29th in completions per game last season, and while that could increase, they're not all of a sudden going to be an above average team in terms of passing volume. So the overwhelmingly likely outcome is that Brown has a few spiked weeks here and there. I'm not even sure the ceiling is that high. We know that Diggs is incredible in the deep game, and so they might not even use J.Brown that many times deep, but you got to think about it. He's going to have a few games where he posts some solid stat lines, but it's going to come with a lot of duds. And so if you're in a best ball league, sure. But most of you watching this video are in redraft leagues. And in a half PPR and a full PPR redraft leagues of 10 or 12 teams, which is like 99% of you, just don't do it. You know, it's a guy that you just stay away from. I don't see the upside unless Diggs were to get hurt. And he's just going too early to be effectively a handcuff receiver. Just someone that you're just not going to be able to trust unless there's an injury. There are other players who have far more upside, not only at wide receiver, but other positions. So I would save that pick for someone who can actually break out. The fourth wide receiver we'll go over today is D.Slayton, which I think is one that might shock some of you, especially since I did have him as a sleeper for a good chunk of the summer. I have since removed him from the sleepers list. But I'm officially off Slayton, especially after his ADP rise. So he was going a lot later, earlier in the summer. One of the biggest reasons I'm off him is his schedule. Honestly, the Giants have a brutal schedule overall, but especially, and this is the most important, to start the season. Everyone likes to look at players, not look at schedule, and say, ooh, he's got a chance to break out. Or then they look at schedule and say, well, he's got, the 8th hardest schedule, which effectively is medium. Like, I only really look at it when it's kind of at the polls. But you look at it more for early season. What's going to happen over this first month? How is someone's value going to change after the first 4 or 5 games? The Giants open the season playing the Steelers, Bears, 49ers, Rams. That's brutal. And they do have the 3rd most difficult early season schedule for wide receivers. And that means it is very likely that Giants skill players are going to start slow. And because of this, if you like Slayton, you love his talent, you kind of like the value where you're getting him, it might be better off for you to either pick him up on free agency, because there's a very real chance someone drafts him in the 10th round and they look at what he's producing over these first 3-4 games and they're like, well, that's not cutting it. And we already know the first month is very important for waivers. There's going to be a lot of waiver decisions to be made in this first month, and there's going to be a lot of players we look at that we weren't even considering right now that are going to be must-adds in week 1 and 2. And it's very possible if Slayton starts slow, he gets dropped. That's when you pounce. Or maybe, someone doesn't drop him, they're still holding on, but he's had, 3 duds in 4 games, they're finding he's not consistent, and before week 5 against Dallas, maybe you trade for him. But I am very, very confident in saying that Slayton's value overall will be lower in week 2, 3, 4 than it is in the draft. And since we know his value is going to go down, I don't want to pay this increased price point during the draft. We're always looking for value in fantasy. And when someone's most likely outcome is that their value is going to drop soon, it's just not smart to draft them. And this is only really looking at the schedule. But you also consider what he did last season. 8 touchdowns on 48 receptions, despite just 6 total red zone targets. He had 2 touchdowns from 5 yards out. But do you know how far out all the other touchdowns were? 22, 28, 35, 35, 39, and 55 yards out. That's not sustainable. Guys who consistently post high touchdown totals are the ones who are featured in the red zone. And not only the red zone, inside the 10 and inside the 5. But Slayton had a very small role in the red zone last season, and that's in a season where Barkley, Evan Ingram, Sterling Shepard, they missed a combined 16 weeks. He's probably going to have an even smaller role this season while those guys are healthy. So when you combine this fairly obvious regression with just a brutal start to the season for a schedule, then I really, really think he's going to start out slow and then his value is going to dip. And why would you draft someone who their value is going to dip? Final receiver we'll go over today is M.Williams. And I've really never understood the appeal of M.Williams. In his second season, he scored an absurd 11 touchdowns on just 43 receptions and 2 or 3 carries. I don't remember how many carries, but he's not a guy that typically give a lot of carries to. He just had that one end around that went for the long touchdown. But he still finished as a wide receiver 32 in points per game. So he's got 11 touchdowns still because he's not that involved in the offense, just the wide receiver 32 in points per game. Then in his 3rd year, he has the obvious touchdown regression because anyone who scores at that high of a rate is going to come down to earth. And so he finishes 45th in points per game. Now this season, they're expected to play at one of the slowest paces in the league, and he's transitioning to a new quarterback. Yet a ton of people like him as a sleeper, even after suffering his shoulder injury. People are still taking him in the 11th and the 12th round. Why? The Chargers have Keenan Allen, Hunter Henry, Austin Eckler. Where are you finding the volume for even a healthy M.Williams to be fantasy viable? He's still being taken ahead of guys like Justin Jefferson, Preston Williams, Deshaun Jackson, Anthony Miller. I don't understand that. He has no upside. It does look like he's going to play in week 1. So he has this injury. It looks like maybe he could miss 2, 3, even 4 weeks of the season. It looks like he'll play week 1, but obviously not be 100%. But unless you think he takes this incredible step forward this season, I don't understand where you're finding the volume for him to be startable in fantasy. And this is startable on a good team. I guess he could start on like the 8th best team in your league, but we're trying to win. We're trying to draft players who would start for us potentially at times on a championship team. And he's just not going to be a starting wide receiver on a championship team. There's absolutely a path for the wide receivers I mentioned before, but not really for M.Williams. So I don't understand why people are drafting him so high even with this injury. So those are 5 wide receivers that you either shouldn't have drafted or shouldn't draft, depending on when your draft actually occurs. If you want to see the full list of players I would target and avoid, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.